Hello everybody, and thanks for coming to our presentation today. What we want to do in this short presentation is simply introduce you to HIFI, or High Frequency Impulse for Microgravity, which is an exercise countermeasure which we believe is the future of deep space exploration and exercise on ISS. So the plan for this presentation is pretty straightforward. First of all, I'm going to talk really briefly about the need for exercise countermeasures and the current approaches that are taken on ISS. From this, I'm then going to develop a kind of design specification for the next generation of exercise countermeasures, in particular addressing some of the challenges that are not fully met by the existing approaches. Having done this, I'm then going to introduce HIFI, and I'll show how HIFI does address these challenges in a very elegant and sophisticated way. Finally, I'll close this presentation by telling you about our research plans and what we'll be getting up to over the next year or so. So I think that most of the people watching this presentation will be comfortable with the idea that spending time in space is associated with a decline in physical capacity. And that's because the human body is a wonderfully adaptable system. We have this fantastic capacity to adapt to the stresses that are placed upon our body. Now, one of the key stresses that our bodies experience on a minute-to-minute basis is the loading of our musculoskeletal system by forces that are a result of the gravitational pull from the Earth. The problem is that when we're in space, we're not subject to this gravitational pull. And so the forces that are loading our musculoskeletal system are much, much smaller. Because our bodies are so adaptable, we quickly start to accommodate these reduced forces. And this leads to substantial declines in a range of different physical capacities. For this reason, maintaining physical function has become one of the key challenges for space travel. So having characterized the nature of the challenge, now let's talk about the current approach to it on ISS. There are 3 exercise devices on ISS. One is a resistance training device, and the other are cardiovascular training devices. Astronauts undergo extensive training programs, and physical training, including setup and close down of activity, accounts for 25% of the working day on ISS. However, despite this amount of time spent on training, it's still common for astronauts to return to Earth having experienced significant deconditioning. So based on what we've just learned about current exercise countermeasures on ISS, what are some of the qualities that we'd want to see in the next generation of exercise countermeasures? Well, clearly one of the most important challenges that needs to be addressed is to optimize a training stimulus. Firstly, we want to make sure that astronauts aren't deconditioning while they're in space. And secondly, it would be desirable if we can do so whilst using less time for training. Similarly, we also want to optimize the engineering of the devices that we're using. As we saw on the last slide, currently there are 3 different exercise devices on ISS. This takes up considerable space, and the setup of these devices is also time-consuming. A third key challenge is the fact that when we're exercising in space, clearly we want to be exerting lots of forces because that's what provides the stimulus to our body for adaptation. However, it's really important that those forces aren't transmitted to the spacecraft. And so designing exercise countermeasures which minimize this force transmission is also a key challenge. So the bulk of this presentation is going to be me talking through each of these three challenges in turn and showing how HIFI addresses them. And so we'll start with the first challenge. That is, how can the training stimulus provided by the exercise countermeasure be optimized? So one exercise modality which shows a lot of promise as an exercise countermeasure is repeated jumping. And there's a few reasons for this. Firstly, maximal jumping does require us to have quite high activation of our muscles to perform the jump. But then secondly, when we land after jumping, that results in high impact forces. And as we know, it's forces that we're interested in order to stimulate adaptation. So there's quite an important study by the European Space Agency into the potential of repeated jumping as an exercise countermeasure. And this was a bed rest study. And bed rest studies are important because they're the best simulation of the deconditioning that occurs in microgravity that we can perform terrestrially. And so what ESA did is they studied the ability of a short but intense exercise bout of repeated jumping to ameliorate deconditioning due to bed rest. And what's exciting in this study is that repeated jumping was shown to be very effective for decreasing deconditioning, and that this effect can be gained with a very minimal amount of exercise time, certainly in comparison to the amount of time that astronauts spend exercising on ISS currently. So we've established that jumping is an attractive exercise modality, but then the question arises, well, how can we jump in space? And that's where HIFI comes in. Now, HIFI is a horizontal jump sled where the resistance that's used to simulate the effect of gravity is provided by high tensile springs. HIFI currently exists as a fully working prototype that's been beautifully engineered by 2EFX, the special effects team that just won an Oscar for their work in the film 1917. So I think the best way for you to quickly learn what HIFI is about is simply to see it in action. And so what I've got on this slide is a video of a member of our team performing jump activity on HIFI. I've got some more video on the next slide, and on that slide I won't have any narration so that you can also hear the audio track from the video. I think that's really important for you to get a full understanding of what's going on, and it'll give you a real sense of the type of force expression that's involved, especially when you have an elephant exercising on HIFI. As an aside, I'm allowed to say that as it's me exercising in the video. As you would imagine, we've done some analysis of what's going on when people exercise on HIFI. And this analysis was possible due to the financial support that we've received from the UK Space Agency. And so the data you see on this slide actually relates to the trial that we've just watched. So what you've got here is the force expression at the feet during jump trials on HIFI compared to the force expression that's seen during vertical jumping. And the most important point to take away from this analysis is that it demonstrates that in using HIFI, we can generate these really high impact forces which are likely to be effective in stimulating considerable adaptation. So the next challenge that we had was to minimize force transmission to the spacecraft. And clearly this is going to be a major problem if we consider jumping, where we're looking for these impact forces whenever we land. So HIFI incorporates a pretty elegant solution to this challenge. And that is that HIFI consists of an upper and a lower carriage that move synchronously equal and opposite to each other. The movement of the two carriages away from each other is resisted by the high tensile springs. And when you exert force on HIFI, you do so by displacing the two carriages away from each other against the resistance provided by the springs. What this means is that an equal and an opposite force are acting on the upper and the lower carriages. And so the net force that's acting on HIFI is zero. So classical mechanics tells us that there should be no force transmission to the spacecraft. But this is a theoretical assumption, and we have done some work to assess the truth of this. So again, as part of the UK Space Agency project that we've just completed, we commissioned a finite element analysis of exercise on HIFI in microgravity. And I guess the highlight of that work is simply that it confirmed that in microgravity we would expect that force transmission to the mounting surface will be minimal. The final challenge that I identified near the start of this presentation was to minimize space and setup time requirements. And again, I think the best way to illustrate for you how well HIFI addresses this challenge is with a short bit of video.
Shoulder pads are going to be attached. They're adjustable in their positioning. They're also asymmetrical, so it accommodates different heights of user and also different widths of shoulders. Taking off the upper carriage cover, this allows access to the springs underneath. Once released, both carriages will slide apart. We can unstow the jump board and then secure that into the upright jumping position, and then slide the carriage back. As you're pushing one carriage, the upper will automatically slide. We can hook up the springs. We have 1 to 5 springs on there. Carriage cover going back on top. This also has the accommodation for the harness straps, again adjustable in their position. Handles being attached. They are also adjustable to accommodate different heights of jumper and also where they prefer to actually hold on to. The load goes through the shoulder pads, but also the person can hang on to when they're jumping. Attaching onto the harness, that simply clips on. Again, multi-adjustment to suit the user.
I think it's also worth adding at this point that the logistical advantages associated with HIFI aren't limited to its quick setup and its small space requirements. In addition, it's very, very easy to adjust the load on HIFI. And because the resistance is provided by springs, there's no low pressure cylinders or seals that might present a risk to the spacecraft if they were to fail. So I hope I've convinced you that HIFI is an elegant solution to permit jumping in space. But that's just the start of the description of what HIFI can do. In fact, HIFI is a really versatile multimodal exercise device. And again, I'll try and show you this by showing a little bit of video.
Jump board has been stowed and we've added a chest and back plate to it, plus the outriggers, and the seat belt has been moved into a different configuration. So the user's seated, their chest sternum is up against that chest pad. That allows the load to be directed through their sternum when they're pulling on the ropes. enabling a variety of movements as well as rotations, again directing the load through that chest pad. The chest pad is a multi-directional pad. It allows for pivoting, so the user can rotate to the left and to the right, and also that chest pad is adjustable as well. This time what was a chest pad is now going to be a back pad. The user now sitting, they can have their knees bent or legs out straight. The load that they're pushing away from their body is then transferred through the back pad all the way down through HIFI. So we're going through the ropes from the outriggers via some pulleys that the spring tension, which is adjustable. The user can now do circumduction through the shoulders, getting multi-directional loads going through that shoulder joint. The user supine with feet in straps, and the lap strap is around their waist. They're extending their legs. Now they've gone into slight external rotation through the hips, heels are squeezed together. Now they're doing hip extension and flexion, hamstrings and glute maximus working. All the pressures going through the shoulder pads, but also they're holding onto the handrails. Circumduction of the hip joints in one direction and then in the reverse direction.
So I've taken you through a real whistle-stop tour of HIFI, and I hope you've got a flavour for what HIFI is and the sort of work that we've done on it already. And what I wanted to close this presentation with was just spending a couple of minutes telling you about the next steps that we have planned. And so I guess the major thing that we need to know for HIFI is whether it can be used in microgravity, and whether when it's used in microgravity it has the advantages that we think it does. And so in order to test this, we've partnered with ESA's European Astronaut Centre in order to get access to a parabolic flight campaign through their cooperation agreement with the French space agency CNES. And so what we'll be doing next year is travelling to France as part of a UK Space Agency funded project to put HIFI through its paces in microgravity. And where our two key questions are, firstly, well, can you jump in microgravity using HIFI? And secondly, is force transmission to the aircraft minimized? The work that we're doing with HIFI isn't just limited to hardware development though. We're also working on software which will support HIFI, and in particular using musculoskeletal modeling technology in order to estimate the type of loading that's going through the bones and muscles when someone is exercising on HIFI. And so ultimately our vision is that we'll be able to predict in real time the types of forces that a user of HIFI is experiencing. And then that will allow the dose of exercise that's administered to a user to be very, very tightly controlled. This type of quantification of the training stimulus that's being delivered to an athlete or an astronaut is pretty unprecedented, and we're excited about the possibilities for really refining the way that exercise can be prescribed to populations as therapy or medicine. So that brings us to the end of this presentation. I hope we've managed to give you a bit of a flavour for what HIFI is, and I hope I've managed to excite you a little bit about its potential capacities. If you do have any questions, please do get in contact with us. And I'd also invite you to follow HIFI on social media so that you can keep up to date with our progress towards and the performance of our parabolic flight campaign. Thank you very much.